With all the news articles I'm seeing on the internet, with Facebook, they post news articles about what's going on over in the Middle East and how certain women are being treated. I just read an article yesterday where they're going to put to death a woman an Islam woman married a Christian man. She's pregnant and they're going to put her to death. You see these type of articles all over the place, and I thought, let's talk about the roots of Islam. Well, there's a lot of seeking of God these days. A lot of question asking around our country as a result of September 11th a few years ago. And one of the questions we've all been wondering is, who are these people? The Muslims. Where did they come from? What do they believe? My purpose in this message is to help us to be as wise as serpents, yet gentle as doves about the happenings around us these days. One time in the Old Testament, King David was assessing the strength of the people he had with him. And in 1 Chronicles 12, verse 32, it says this. It says, he had with him men of Issachar who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. That's what we want to be. People who understand the times we're living in, so we can be responsive and productive members of Yahweh's kingdom. Another time in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul told the first century followers that they too should be very clear and mature in their thinking and understanding of the events happening around them. He said, brothers, stop thinking like children. In regard to evil, be infants. But in your thinking, be adults. 1 Corinthians 14:20. In other words, like Yeshua, he's saying, be informed. Don't stick your head in the sand and think circumstances will go away. Don't become ugly or hate-filled. Be innocent of evil, but be informed. So that's our purpose, to be informed so we can respond gently but wisely to our world and its present horrors. Okay? So let's talk about Islam. The name Islam means submission or surrender in Arabic. People who are surrendered are called Muslims, because in Arabic, Muslim means the one who is submitted. Specifically, Muslims are submitted to Allah, the name that has come to stand for the one true God in Islamic understanding. You'll notice that Islam is a widespread religion. Currently, there are over 1.2 billion Muslims worldwide. Their numbers are growing rapidly because of their practice of polygamy. Every man can have up to 4 wives as long as he loves them all the same. And the encouragement they receive to sire large families. Where the world's population doubles about every 40 years, the Islam population doubles every 26. Because of the number of recent immigrants to this country, Islam has now overtaken Judaism as the second largest religion in America. The founder is Muhammad, who is believed to be the last and great prophet of Allah. No one knows the exact date of Muhammad's birth, but we can narrow it down to within a few years, around 570 AD. Muhammad was born in the city of Mecca, along with the Arabian Peninsula, and it was an oasis town of about 3,000 inhabitants, not far from the coast of the Red Sea. Mecca is a modern-day Saudi Arabia. As a result of Muhammad's birth there, and a meteorite I'll mention in a minute, it has become the holiest city in the Islamic peoples. But for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, the roots of Islam actually go back further than that. According to the Bible, it all started in Genesis 16. So I want to read you the account. Now, although having children that way, as it's described in this account, it was acceptable in cultural practice back then, Abraham didn't exercise faith in Yahweh's promise. So he took matters into his own hands. Genesis 16, starting in verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. Sarai said unto Abram, Behold, now Yahweh has restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened unto the voice of Sarai. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. And he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. Sarai said unto Abram, My wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid into thy bosom. And when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. Yahweh judge between me and thee. But Abram said unto Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thy hand. Do to her as it please you. And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. And the angel of Yahweh found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, whence camest thou, and where wilt thou go? And she said, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai. The angel of Yahweh said unto her, Return to thy mistress, and submit thyself under her hands. And the angel of Yahweh said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. And the angel of Yahweh said unto her, Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shall call his name Ishmael, because Yahweh has heard thy affliction, and he will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. He shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. She called the name of Yahweh that spoke unto her, Thou Elohim seest me. For she said, Have I also here looked after him that sees me? Wherefore the well was called Bir Lahoi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bare Abram a son. And Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abraham. So Ishmael was the first son of Abraham. Muslims are descendant of Abraham through Ishmael. But Yahweh's plan for Abraham was to have a son through his wife, not his concubine. So 13 years later, when Isaac was born to his wife, she did what many protective mothers might do. She insisted that Abraham, through the older son, who might threaten her son's life and inheritance, throw him out. Abraham didn't want to do that because he loved Ishmael. But we all know that if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. So Yahweh comes to Abraham while he's thinking about this and promises that he will take care of Ishmael. And Yahweh says, I will make the son of thy maidservant into a nation also, because he is your offspring. Genesis 21, verse 13. Yahweh promised that Ishmael would become the father of a great nation. So Abraham sends Ishmael and Hagar away, and the next time we see Ishmael is at his father's funeral. The final word on him is in Genesis 25, verse 18, which says, his descendants settled in the area from Havilah to Shur, near the border of Egypt, and they lived in hostility towards all their brothers. Genesis 25, 18. Which, unfortunately, is true to this day. His sons lived in hostility towards all their brothers, which seems to describe pretty well the relationship between the sons of Ishmael and their cousins, the Israelites. They lived in hostility towards one another, and they're still doing it 4,000 years later. So both Islam and Christianity trace their roots to Abraham. They are two branches off the Jewish tree of antiquity. Yeshua, descended from Isaac, was born approximately 4 BC, and Muhammad descended from Ishmael and was born approximately 570 AD. According to historians who recorded Muhammad's life approximately 100 years later, Muhammad was born into a minor branch of the Bedouin caste of merchant traders called the Quraysh. His father, Abdullah, died a few months before he was born, and his mother died when he was 6 years old. Muhammad lived with his grandfather for the next 2 years, but he died as well. So Muhammad was taken in by an uncle named Abu Talib. Although it's not certain, many biographers say that Muhammad's uncle, or at least the extended family he was part of, were the caretakers for a black meteorite, and it's called the Kaaba stone. At that time, the Arab people were polytheistic, worshiping many gods. One of the ways they worshipped was by making a pilgrimage to visit this stone, the Kaaba. Muhammad taught that Abraham had placed the stone there and made it one of the holiest relics of Muslim faith. When Muhammad was 25 years old, he married a 40-year-old wealthy widow of his clan named Khadijah. He proved very adept in running her family business, and together he and his wife had 6 children, 4 healthy daughters, 2 sons who died in infancy. After his wife's death, he married several more wives. Muhammad did a lot of praying on his own and in solitude, often in caves, and over time began to hear what he believed was the voice of God. One night in 610, Muhammad had a visitation which he believed to be the angel Gabriel. Gabriel told him, "In the name of thy Lord, the Creator, who created mankind from a clot of blood, recite." Muhammad memorized what the vision told him to recite, and he began relating what he had heard in the visions to his family and friends. Muhammad began telling his friends that all of the gods they were worshiping, only one, the God they called Allah, was a true God and demanded absolute submission to himself. In addition, he taught that God had called him as Allah's last great prophet. His first converts were his wife, a favorite slave who he had freed, and his cousin Ali. As his number of followers grew, the city fathers of Mecca started to become uneasy. So in 622, he left Mecca for an oasis settlement 250 miles north called Yathrib. Rich, once he had gained power there, he renamed it Medina. It means city of prophet. Medina had become the second holiest city for Muslims because this is really where Islam developed. And a side note, Jerusalem is Islam's third holiest city. They revere the site where Abraham was told to sacrifice his son Isaac. They also believe that as Muhammad was dying, God transported him to that site and from there took him to heaven. That site happens to be on the Temple Mount of Jerusalem, where the original Jewish temple had been. So Jews and Muslims to this day dispute over the Temple Mount area, making for all sorts of tensions between them. In Medina, Muhammad preached about all manner of things, both religious and secular. For Islam, there is no distinction between the two. All aspects of life are governed by doctrines of faith. So Muhammad taught on matters of marriage and divorce, inheritance, punishment for thefts, treatment of the poor, even questions on diet and personal hygiene. And he carefully spelled out how relationships should go between his followers and unbelievers. As Muhammad spoke, his followers would memorize his words or scratch them down on parchment or palm leaves or pieces of leather. 100 years later, his followers would take these oral remembrances and various written fragments to compile the Quran, the authoritative book of the Muslim religion. Chief among Muhammad's teaching was that at sunrise, sunset, and 3 other times during the day, Muslims should prostrate themselves toward Jerusalem and offer prayer to Allah. According to one book that I read, and this is hard to believe, so I read it from the text, it was in the time-honored tradition of the desert for a people in need to attain their material requirements by raiding. Find that in the March of Islam, page 37. The natural enemy of the Muslim was the Quraysh tribe of Mecca, since the Quraysh had been persecuting them. During one of the raids in which the Muslims were outnumbered 3-1, the Prophet decreed, "Not one who fights this day and bears himself with steadfast courage shall meet his death without Allah bringing him to paradise." With that incentive, they routed the superior force, and Muhammad instantly became a widely admired figure, his fame spreading throughout the Bedouin tribes in the area. Muhammad began having conflict with some of the Jewish tribes who inhabited Medina. So one by one, he exiled them from the city. The final Jewish tribe, named the Banu Karanza, so infuriated him by fraternizing with his enemies that he slaughtered all 800 adult males and sold their women and children as slaves. With that history of conflict, once his forces had forced Mecca to surrender to him, he instructed his followers from then on to no longer face Jerusalem when they pray, but to face Mecca. Muhammad died on June 8th, 632. This caused great conflict among his followers, and some believed that the movement should continue with one of Muhammad's relatives as successor. Still others believed that in Arabic tribal tradition, the most able man should be chosen as successor. This argument gave rise to 2 great factions of Islam. We hear them in the news: the Sunnis and the Shiites. And the argument continues to this day. The larger faction chose a friend of Muhammad's named Abu Bakr as its successor, and within 2 years, Abu Bakr had not only subdued all those who had defected at the death of Muhammad, but his generals had conquered all of Arabia. From there, Abu Bakr had his generals and successors then conquered Palestine and Syria. From there, they swept east and overcame the Persian Empire. Moving north, they began eating up the Byzantine territory, and riding west, they conquered Egypt, then Tunisia, Carthage, and all the way to Morocco on the Atlantic shores. From there, they turned northward and conquered Spain in the name of Allah. Within 100 years, they had enveloped 2/3 of the Mediterranean, most of Asia Minor, parts of India, and to the borders of China. Per Muhammad's instructions, Jews and Christians, people of the book, as he called them, were allowed to practice their religion by paying a head tax to the Muslim state. If they converted, they were exempt from the tax. Pagan people who worship multiple gods, were given a choice: convert or die. The only thing that stopped Islam from taking over the then known world were the Frankish tribes of France on the west and the Byzantine Christians of the Constantinople on either east. After that, they continued their advancing more slowly, reaching a peak in the 12th century, fostering great works of architecture, astronomy, mathematics, and poetry, while keeping alive the classic works of Plato and Aristotle and other greats. In the 14th century, there was a new burst of conquering fervor as the Turkish people, Central Asia, were converted. One of their tribal leaders, Osman, founded the Ottoman Empire, which sacked Constantinople in 1453 and had pushed on to Vienna by 1529 and came again to try to sack it in 1683. According to most modern historians, only the bravery of the Austrians and Poles kept Islam from conquering Europe at the time. The Ottoman Empire ended in 1922, when the British and French partitioned all of their lands into smaller, more governable provinces with names like Iran, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, Yemen, Saudi Arabia. This is where we stand today. Islam today is that in 1917 there were 600,000 Arabs and 80,000 Jews living in Palestine. The Arabs thought that was too many. During and after World War II, Jews began pouring into Palestine to create a homeland for themselves. Muslims, remember, consider Jerusalem to be their third holiest city. So they didn't really like that. And of course, native Palestinian Arabs weren't real keen on sharing their limited land and resources with all this religious and radical outsiders. By 1945, Jewish and Arab terrorism and guerrilla warfare was going on in Palestine, and the British decided to disentangle themselves from the whole region. Fighting between the two factions grew fiercer. The British withdrew on May 14, 1948, and Israel declared itself a nation. Israel was immediately recognized by the United States and immediately at war with Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, and Syria. As Israel Prime Minister Ben-Gurion was declaring independence, his generals were fighting off enemies in every direction. Israel had been attacked by her neighbors 3 times, and every time she has both been beaten them back and expanded on her original 1948 territory. That has been a growing source of frustration for her Arab neighbors. In addition, the United States has always been Israel's closest ally, strongest financial backer, and representative on the Security Council of the United Nations. In the early part of the 20th century, American companies began drilling for oil all over the Middle East. The Standard Oil Company was reaping such huge profits from their business with these countries that one after another, starting with Iran in 1951, Each Arab nation nationalized all oil interest in their country, taking over all ownership, control of flow, and all the profits from their oil fields. Since that time, their wealth has been steadily increasing. Their population rising substantially, and they have educated the brightest and best in all the great universities of the West. So that in recent years, they have begun to possess the wealth, manpower, and know-how to not only export Islam, but their more extreme elements have been able to increasingly do things that express their frustrations with the world, that the way they perceive themselves to be treated by the West. A particular considered to be conservative Muslims is the corruption of the world by Western consumerism, with our emphasis on materialism and sensualism and secularism. So you can see how all these currents flow together to bring us to where we are today. And let me make a couple of observations. The Bible predicted that things like this would happen. Yeshua himself said, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come." Matthew 24, verse 6. Elsewhere, he said to his followers, "A time is coming when anyone who kills you will think he is offering a service to Elohim." John 16:2. Because of their belief in jihad and shahira, Islamic fundamentalism is of great threat to us physically. But the real battle is a spiritual one. There is a real spiritual difference between Islam and Christianity. Our greatest defense in this war is prayer. The Bible says in Ephesians 6, verse 12, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1 says, "I exhort therefore that first of all supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men." If you compare Yeshua's life with the teachings of that of Muhammad, Yeshua, John 15, verse 12, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." Muhammad, fight for the sake of God those that fight against you, but do not attack them first. God does not love aggressors. Slay them wherever you find them. Now, I've spent hours reading about the history of Muhammad and how he commanded people death, and how his followers went out and converted the world with the sword. And I was just so thankful that the Elohim that I serve came down, and instead of killing, he healed. Instead of taking life, he laid down his own on our behalf. Here's the Bible's prediction about Yeshua, written 800 years before his coming. "A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out." Isaiah 42, verse 3. Do you know how fragile those two things are? That's the kind of Elohim the Bible says governs the earth and wants to govern our life. Which one seems best to you? The more we know, the more obvious the choice is, isn't it? Matthew 7, verse 15, "Beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravaging wolves." You shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Towards the climax of Yeshua's most famous sermon, and arguably the most widely acclaimed speech of all time, he says, "Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruits you will recognize them." Matthew 7:15, verse 15 and 16. Now, since it's September 11th, large numbers of Americans and a large number of people around the world have wondered about the 19 plane hijackers and their backers who wreaked havoc on the East Coast. Who were they? What drove them? What motivated them? Of course, you're all aware that within hours after our nation's leaders had identified these terrorists as Muslim fundamentalists, which raised a second string of questions. What's a Muslim? What do they believe? What made them think that such an act could be condoned by the Elohim of heaven? In the words of Yeshua, they seem to be wolves in sheep's clothing, which raises a third set of questions. Are they false prophets? Or do they carry with them the commands and commissions of Elohim? So my goal is to answer the second set of questions, and hopefully with the information we discover together, you'll be able to make your own call on this third set. I want you to remind you, our spirit in this, the purpose for spending time on this is not so that we can worry or get angry and figure out how to get revenge, but to be informed so that we can be wise as serpents, gentle as doves, so that we can see things in their proper perspective and respond with the gentleness of Yeshua. With that in mind, what do Muslims believe? You know the word Muslim means one who is submitted. Islam means submitted and surrendered, not peace, as some are saying these days. The Arabic word for peace is shalom. It's a related word because Muslims believe that those who are submitted to Allah experience peace. And I covered the background on Islam, its founder Muhammad, and its history from Genesis 16 of the Bible up to today. And like Christianity and its mother Judaism, Islam is a monotheistic religion. Muhammad's ancestors and contemporaries worship a multitude of gods. And Muhammad became convinced that there was only one God, and that his name was Allah. So he ruthlessly went about preaching belief in this one God and purging the Arabian Peninsula of polytheism. Now, the Christianity that we know outside today, they believe in three in one as God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, all three are one. Muhammad taught that Christianity's belief in the Trinity made them polytheist. But for the most part, he labeled Christians and Jews people of the book. So Muslims have a formula of how they are to give. According to the size of their income, the more you make, the more is required of you. And that includes zakat, from any booty you receive by plundering or defeating an enemy as well. The final two good works are both to be performed during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. Ramadan is the 9th month of the Muslim calendar, and believed to be the month in which the Quran was originally revealed. So it is a very special time to the Muslims. But when it is celebrated, it can be a little confusing to most of the people out there, because they too use the lunar calendar. So it's actually 11 days shorter than our solar year, and therefore Ramadan shifts from one season to another as the year passes on. They fast during the month of Ramadan. They fast from eating, from drinking, smoking, and sexual activity during daylight hours. They can do all they want at night. They perform the Hajj at least once in your lifetime, pilgrimage to Mecca, performing certain activities there. The Hajj is an Arabic word for pilgrimage to Mecca. Muhammad's polytheistic ancestors performed an annual Hajj to Mecca to worship their many gods, but in particularly one associated with the Kaaba stone. So when Muhammad received his revelations of the one true God, he insisted that all his followers, if they were able, perform the Hajj at least once in a lifetime. Of course, that has gotten harder since Islam spread throughout the globe. So the stipulation is that if you are able. There are various rituals to be performed while they're on the Hajj, and 6 to 7 of them to be done once you've arrived in Mecca. And since, like Christianity, part of Islam's value is the value of community, all pilgrims are encouraged to make the Hajj during the holy month of Ramadan, so it can get quite crowded in Mecca during this month, particularly on the 27th of Ramadan, which is thought to be a special day of power. Among some of the poorer Muslim communities around the world, taking the Hajj is so rare and difficult that when a person returns from Mecca, they are adding al-Hajj to the end of his name as an honor. Now, the nature of paradise. Ask any good Muslim and he or she will tell you that if a person is faithful to perform these 5 steps, that they will eventually make it to paradise. 2 things you should know about paradise, in their view. One is that it is a bit different than the Bible's picture. Here's a description from the 55th chapter of the Quran. They shall recline on couch lined with thick brocade, and within each will hang the fruits of both gardens. Which of the Lord's blessings would you deny? Therein are bashful virgins, whom neither man nor genie will have touched before. Which of your Lord's blessings would you deny? Virgins as fair as coral and rubies. Shall the reward of goodness be anything but good? In chapter 56 it says, they shall recline on jeweled couches face to face, and there shall wait on them immortal youths with bowls and a cup of purest wine, that will neither pain their heads nor take away their reason, with fruits of their own choices and flesh of fowl that they will relish. And theirs shall be the dark-eyed horus, chaste as hidden pearls, a reward for the deeds. You know, it's interesting. I read a substantial portion of the Quran, and it did not find one reference to a Brad Pitt-like male serving the woman who make it to heaven. In chapter 49, the true believers are those that have faith in God and His apostle and never doubt, and who fight with their wealth and their persons for the cause of God. Such are those whose faith is true. The other is that Allah, being all sovereign, has ultimate say over who gets in and who doesn't. So even faithfulness isn't an absolute guarantee. And there are inferences to a transitional place like the Catholic purgatory. So even fairly faithful Muslims aren't thought of as going directly to paradise. The only sure way to be transported immediately to heaven from this life is to be killed in the act of jihad. Jihad is the holy war against those who threaten the community. One Islamic source I read said jihad war against those who threaten the community, whether against hostile unbelievers outside of its own non-Muslim, within it who broke the covenant of protection, was usually regarded as an obligation, practically equivalent of one of the pillars. The duty of jihad, like the other pillars, was based on our annex saying, "O you who believe, fight the unbelievers who are near you." One ominous prophecy found in the Hadith, it's a companion volume of the Quran, where in the Hadith 4, verse 109, it says, "The prophet said, the first army amongst my followers who will invade Caesar's city will be forgiven their sins." One Islamic commentator followed that passage with these words. He said Muhammad had a vision for making Islam a universal religion. One of the keys to fulfilling this desire would be to conquer Rome in the name of Allah. One could question what right Muhammad's armies would have to invade a powerful city and impose their religion on its inhabitants. The answer is that it was the will of Allah for all heathen everywhere to become Muslim. In this tradition, Muhammad gives assurances of warriors having their sins forgiven because of their involvement in jihad. This promise seemed to aptly apply only to the first army to enter Rome. Most likely this was because of their inevitable high casualty rate and the initial wave of soldiers seeking to penetrate the city. In 1400 years, this particular promise of forgiveness of sins is yet to be claimed by Muslim warriors. Rome remains unconquered by Islam. Within Islam, the world is described as divided into two houses. One is called Dar Salam, the House of Peace. That's a place where Muslims live. The other is called Dar al-Harab, the House of War. That is the place where the people who are not yet Muslims live. One more concept that might be helpful to you is that Muslims call Sharia, and we hear that in the news lately, the Sharia law, obedience to the law derived from God, God's command in the Quran. Unlike Christianity, Islam makes no distinction between church and state, which is why in countries submitted to the Sharia, many of the heads of state are clerics and imams. Like almost all religions, Muslims think that their description of spirituality in heaven is the only right and true one, and that their description of the pathway to heaven is the only way, which is in part why they are willing to go to such great lengths to convert people. Like Christianity, their goal is to win every person on the planet to faith in their God and His way of living. So, in their mind, because Muhammad commanded them to convert, subjugate, or eliminate all non-believers, many are willing to go to great lengths to make that happen. Some of those lengths you and I would consider unethical. I see pictures of people giving the thumbs up with the raw heads on the floor. Happy they did it. Immersing myself in all this research just made everything seem so dark to me. Maybe it's feeling that way to you too now. So what I did to bring a sense of hope back into focus was to spend a few minutes reading some of the teachings of Yeshua. That really helped me. I just did a comparison of Muslim prophecy with a prophecy of Yeshua about the future of his followers. During what is known as the Last Supper, Yeshua let his disciples know that he was going to the stake the next day to die for the sins of the world. This shocked the disciples because they couldn't bear the thought of living without Yeshua being with them. Yeshua looks from one shocked face to another, all the way around the room, and he says to them, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in Elohim, trust also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I'm going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be there where I am. You know the way to the place where I am going." And Thomas said to him, "Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way?" Yeshua answered, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really knew me, you would know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him." Philip said, "Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us." Yeshua answered, "Don't you know me, Philip, even after I have been among you for such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Don't you know that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you are not my own words. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. Or at least believe the evidence of the miracles themselves." John 14, verse 1 through 11. In this short talk, Yeshua disagreed with virtually every teaching about the future put forth in the Quran. For instance, in contrast to the fear factor about working hard enough to merit heaven, Yeshua says to his followers, "Don't be troubled about heaven and your place in it. You don't have to prepare your place in heaven. I am preparing it for you. Your responsibility is to place your trust in me." Besides that, Yeshua would say, Yahweh is not whimsical. He does issue guarantees. Yahweh makes promises to his children. And you know what? He has always kept his promise. And you yourselves know that. Because for 3.5 years, I, Yahweh's Son, have walked among you, and I have always kept my promises to you. One of the disciples, a little confused, asked, "Well, Yeshua, you say we know the way to heaven, but we're not sure, so tell us again." To which Yeshua, as clearly and succinctly as he knows how, just articulates the means to gain entrance to heaven. He says, "Fellas, it's through me. Make no mistake about this. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." To back up those words, the next morning Yeshua went to the stake on behalf of your sins and mine, paying our way to heaven. 3 days and 3 nights after his crucifixion, he made his way back from death to prove that he is the way, and to make the way for us. Of all Yeshua's teachings, many people find this one statement the hardest to swallow. This is a statement of arrogance, they say. Because if I'm reading this right, Yeshua is claiming absolute exclusivity on his way to the Father's kingdom. That just seems too narrow for me. You know, I never heard this exclusivity or narrowness complaint leveled against Islam. You know why? Because most people who make this statement have never studied the alternative. Muhammad was very clear. According to his teachings, it was the way of Allah or the way of death. And in his talk, Yeshua was very clear. Without a touch of arrogance, but only compassion, he explained to his disciples that the way to the kingdom of Yahweh was by following him. Going on with Yeshua's talk, he says something that is very encouraging. He says, "In my Father's house are many rooms." What he's meaning by that is that there is a special place in his kingdom for every person who is willing to follow Yeshua. There is no shortage of rooms in the kingdom. Whoever will may come. Plenty of room for all. And then in contrast to Muhammad's claim that Yeshua was not the son of Yahweh, but simply a lesser prophet than himself, Yeshua comes right out and claims positional equality with the Father. I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. He says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And then, unlike Muhammad, Yeshua boldly claimed to be able to do miracles. And he asked his followers to examine those miracles to see if they don't substantiate his claim to be equal to the Father. You know how you come out of an intense movie sometimes and just say, I need to get my mind on something else? Well, that's how I felt after studying about Islam. So I opened the words of Yeshua and found it light and hope-filled. And it felt true to me. You have to make that call for yourself. And I hope that you will, if you haven't done so yet. But hopefully, all of us will have the information we need to make a choice of which to follow. May Yahweh open your eyes to his Son, Yeshua, and bless you.